Welcome to this deep dive. We're here to sift through the sources you sent us and pull out the really critical insights you need.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you sent in quite a mix this time. We've got global conflicts, trade issues, the whole BRICS dynamic, immigration, food production.
Right.
Even a hypothetical World War III scenario. It's a lot.
It really is a broad sweep. And our job, I guess, is to try and connect some of those dots.
Exactly, to see how these things link up. Because you're looking for some clarity, right, in what feels like a pretty complex world.
And it is complex. This collection really highlights that. You've got immediate crises sitting right alongside these huge long-term shifts. And potential future scenarios, too. It shows how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? What happens over here can really ripple outwards.
Totally. And the sources themselves, they offer different viewpoints, different potential outcomes. So we're not aiming for one single answer here.
No, definitely not. It's more about exploring the possibilities, the range of expert thinking.
Yeah, and maybe uncovering some surprising links along the way. Some aha moments, hopefully.
Hopefully.
Okay, so where should we start? Maybe with what's probably top of mind for a lot of people, these ongoing global conflicts and the scary idea of another world war.
Right. The sources you shared definitely flag the big ones. Ukraine, the Israel-Palestine conflict, tensions around the South China Sea. It paints a picture of, significant instability.
It certainly does. But do the experts actually think a global war, like World War I or II, is likely?
The general consensus seems to be that predicting something on that scale is incredibly difficult, and maybe hopefully less likely than it might feel sometimes.
Okay, that's somewhat reassuring. Why? What are the main factors kind of pushing against a global conflict right now?
Well, there are a few big ones. First off, just the sheer level of economic interdependence globally.
Ah, right, the supply chains and all that.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Countries are just so tangled up in trade and investment. A major war would be economically catastrophic for basically everyone involved. It tears apart everything from raw materials to the gadgets we buy.
Makes sense. What else?
Second, you've got international organizations in diplomacy. Now, they're not perfect, obviously,
Really?
but they do provide channels, mechanisms to de-escalate things, to talk, even when it doesn't always work out.
Okay, and the third point?
And the third is just the horrifying destructive power of modern weapons.
It's a deterrence factor.
Precisely. The potential consequences are so immense, so devastating, that it hopefully makes leaders think very, very carefully before initiating something huge.
Yeah, you'd certainly hope so. But, okay, the sources must also point to factors that increase the risk, right?
Right.
What are those warning signs?
They do. A major one is the rise we're seeing in nationalism, in protectionism.
Kind of an us-first mentality.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
When countries focus inward too much, become less willing to cooperate, it just breeds friction, distrust. Then there's competition. Competition for resources, energy, minerals, water, you name it. And also just for global influence. That's a classic driver of tension.
And probably the most dangerous one.
Maybe the potential for simple miscalculation or miscommunication, especially when tensions are already high.
Right, a mistake, an accident escalating.
Exactly. History's full of examples of how easily that can happen. It's a constant risk.
So it's a real push and pull. Factors for stability, factors for instability. Okay, now some sources looked at that hypothetical World War III, a grim topic, but what do they say about the potential consequences?
Well, they're about as catastrophic as you can imagine. We're talking massive, massive human suffering. Deaths, huge numbers of displaced people, infrastructure just wiped out, transport, energy, communications.
Leading to total societal breakdown, basically.
Pretty much. And economically.
Yeah.
Global collapse. A deep, prolonged depression seems almost certain. You lose trade, you lose infrastructure, you lose so much human capital.
And the environmental impact.
Also devastating. Modern warfare, especially if it involves, nuclear weapons, but even large-scale conventional war, it could cause long-term severe damage to ecosystems, to health. Just awful.
It sounds truly apocalyptic. And I think the sources were clear that in that kind of scenario, the idea of a winner is, it's meaningless.
Completely meaningless, especially if nuclear weapons are used. The destruction is just too widespread, the fallout too long-lasting. Any victory would be totally hollow. Even a big conventional war could have such knock-on effects globally that any strategic gain is just wiped out.
So if we imagine this terrible hypothetical conflict, which, again, let's hope stays hypothetical, what things would determine who might sort of fare relatively better, even if winning isn't the right word?
Yeah, relative advantage might be the term. The sources point to a few things. Military strength, obviously. Advanced weapons, conventional and nuclear capabilities.
Sure.
But just as important is economic resilience. Can your country keep essential things running?
Yeah.
Can it adapt to massive shocks? Maintain supply chains somehow?
Right, and technology.
Crucial. AI, cyber warfare. Imagine shutting down an enemy's power grid, hypersonic missiles. That tech edge would be vital.
And alliances.
Absolutely critical. The strength of your partnerships, your diplomatic skill in keeping support, rallying others, that can make a huge difference.
And who did the sources identify as the likely major players in such a scenario?
Well, no huge surprises. The US and NATO, given their military power, tech, and economic base. China and Russia, with their strategic partnership and significant military, including nuclear capability.
Okay, anyone else?
Interestingly, the BRICS nations and other major emerging economies were mentioned too, not necessarily as direct belligerents in every scenario, but potentially as a bloc that could heavily influence the global response, wield considerable sway.
Right, very sobering picture indeed. Let's shift gears slightly. Another area you looked at was trade policies. Tariffs. Can seem dry, but has real impact.
Absolutely. And the first thing the sources stress is just how complex this stuff is.
Yeah.
Experts really don't all agree on whether tariffs, for example, actually work or what their overall effect is.
Okay, so what's the idea behind them? Why do governments use tariffs?
Well, often they're used as a bargaining chip, leveraging trade negotiations.
Okay.
They can also be put in place to try and protect specific domestic industries from foreign competition. Maybe industries seen as vital or ones facing what's perceived as unfair practices.
Like dumping.
Like dumping, yeah.
Yeah.
Or sometimes to try and tackle trade imbalances if one country feels it's importing way more than it's exporting to another.
But there are definite downsides, aren't there? What are the big risks the sources point out?
Oh, definitely. The biggest risk is probably retaliation. Other countries slap on their own tariffs, and suddenly you're in a trade war.
Which hurts everyone.
Pretty much. Tariffs also usually mean higher prices for consumers, right? The cost of imported goods goes up, and that often gets passed along.
Yeah, we feel that in our wallets.
And just overall, protectionism can kind of gum up the works of the global economy. It slows down trade, investment, makes things less efficient.
And the sources mention the current US-China tensions as a key example of this.
Exactly. Those ongoing tensions are a real-world case study. And they're prompting this bigger rethink about global trade, potentially pushing things more towards protectionism.
Okay, that leads us nicely into the next topic. BRICS. This group keeps coming up more and more. Who exactly are they again, for anyone needing a refresher?
Sure. BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. 5 major emerging economies.
And they're significant because
of their sheer scale, really. Put them together and you're looking at something like 40% of the world's population.
Wow.
And maybe around 25%, a quarter of the global GDP. Plus, they're huge players in international trade.
Those numbers are pretty staggering. So this isn't just some talking shop. They have real clout. Where are they making their mark?
The sources point to sort of 3 main areas. First is economic cooperation among themselves.
Right. Trying to boost trade and investment within the group.
Exactly. And they've set up institutions to help with that, like the New Development Bank, or NDB. Some see it as an alternative maybe to the World Bank for funding projects. And there's the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, which is like a safety net if one of them hits financial trouble.
Okay, so economics is one. What else?
Second is global governance. They're pushing for reforms. They want institutions like the IMF and World Bank to give emerging economies, like themselves, a bigger voice, more representation.
A seat at the table, basically.
A bigger seat, yeah. They feel the current setup is still dominated by older powers. And third is geopolitics. They're playing a bigger role regionally and globally.
How so?
Through forums like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SKO, and the G20, they often try to coordinate their positions on big issues. You hear them calling for, more multilateralism, pushing back against unilateral actions by, say, the U.S.
So how does all this BRICS activity feed into that idea of a multipolar world the sources talked about?
Well, it's a key driver of it. The rise of BRICS means we're moving away from a world perhaps dominated by just one superpower. or maybe a couple of Western blocs.
Right. Multiple centers of power.
Exactly. A multipolar world has several influential countries or regions with significant economic and political weight. BRICS, along with other rising economies, makes the global landscape more diverse, more complex, too.
And that complexity brings
What opportunity?
challenges.
Both, really. Opportunities for new kinds of partnerships, maybe different perspectives on global problems, but also challenges in managing things when you have multiple power blocks, potentially with competing interests. It makes diplomacy trickier, perhaps.
Definitely seems more complicated to navigate. Okay, let's switch focus again. Immigration and food production. There seems to be a lot of noise around this connection. What did the sources actually say?
Yeah, they offered a more nuanced view, actually. The key takeaway was that reducing immigration doesn't automatically mean you're going to have food shortages.
Oh, interesting. Why not?
Well, because food production is affected by so many other things. Technology, for one. Automation in farming is increasing all the time.
Right, robotic pickers and things like that?
Exactly. And also the push towards more sustainable agriculture, different farming methods.
Yeah.
These things also impact output and efficiency, often offsetting labor changes.
Okay, so it's not a direct cause and effect. Less immigration equals less food, but is there still a connection?
Yes, there is. The sources acknowledge that some parts of agriculture in many countries do rely heavily on immigrant labor.
For specific jobs, maybe? Seasonal work?
Often, yeah. Physically demanding jobs, seasonal peaks like harvesting. So big shifts in immigration policy can definitely cause labor shortages in those specific sectors. That can impact planting, picking, processing.
So it's more targeted impacts rather than overall collapse.
That seems to be the view. And of course, immigration policies themselves are incredibly complex, right? They're shaped by economic needs, sure, but also social issues, politics, lots of factors.
Right. Okay, final big area, the future for the next generation. Looking ahead, what did the sources see as the major hurdles?
Several big ones loom large. Climate change and environmental degradation are probably at the top of the list.
Yeah.
The consequences are just so far-reaching.
Yeah, hard to overstate that one.
Then there's economic inequality. The gap between rich and poor, access to resources, opportunities, that remains a massive challenge globally. Technology's impact, too, especially AI and automation. What does that mean for jobs? For the nature of work? Big questions there.
Health after recent years.
Absolutely. Global health security, being prepared for the next pandemic,
Yes.
is clearly going to be a major ongoing concern.
That's quite a list. It sounds pretty daunting. Did the sources offer any reasons for optimism, any bright spots?
Yes, definitely. It wasn't all doom and gloom. There's real progress happening in renewable energy, sustainable tech. That offers hope for tackling the climate issue. There's also arguably more global awareness and cooperation on some of these big issues, climate health, than perhaps ever before, even if it feels slow sometimes.
Good for you.
Plus, there's a growing focus, a growing movement, trying to address those inequalities, social and economic. And, technological innovation isn't just a threat. It also offers amazing potential solutions in healthcare, education, environmental cleanup. You name it.
So a mix of serious challenges, but also real potential for progress. Okay, as we wrap up this deep dive, we've really bounced around conflicts, trade, BRICS, food, the future. What are the big threads connecting all this?
I think a few things stand out. One is just how fragile global stability feels.
Yeah.
We see the conflicts, but we also understand the counterweights, like economic ties and deterrence.
The balance is delicate.
Definitely. Another is the clear shift in global power, economically and politically. The rise of groups like BRICS is changing the landscape. We've also seen the complexity around managing vital resources, like food, and the human side of things, like migration. These aren't simple issues with easy answers.
No, definitely not.
And finally, looking ahead, it's clear the next generation faces these huge challenges, but also, hopefully, inherits some powerful tools and a growing awareness needed to tackle them.
And like you said at the start, understanding how all these forces interact, that's really the key to making sense of it all. Hopefully you, our listener, feel you've got a deeper insight into that now.
Yeah, seeing the connections is vital.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with. In this world that seems to be becoming more multipolar with different power centers, shifting alliances, how can individual countries and maybe even individuals like us best adapt?
Yeah.
How do we help shape a future that's, more stable, more sustainable, maybe more prosperous for everyone?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It really is. Something to ponder as you continue exploring these issues. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive.